Hey folks, thanks for taking the time to come to React Native London meetup. It's going to be a tough act to follow after John, but I'll give it my best shot. Speedy styling with Tailwind and React Native. As I'm sure everyone here has experienced, styling is not always necessarily the easiest or most favorably looked upon part of front-end development. So tonight we're going to take a deep dive into how we can take the repetition out of your styling using Tailwind and speed it up by quite a fair bit. My hope is that this will prompt us to have a revisit about the ways that we approach our styling when it comes to modern day frameworks in front end. My name is Mo. I'm a full stack developer at Theodo UK. We are a software consultancy in London, and we have specialized teams that develop software products in a lean or agile manner. Our clients love working with Theodo, and our team in London gets some really great experience working on a wide range of projects, and I can personally testify to that. And on that, yes, we are hiring, so feel free to message me or Arahan or any one of the other organizers if you have any questions or are thinking of applying. Let's jump into it. So a brief slide on what we're going to cover tonight. Firstly, for a little bit of background and just to justify the thinking behind Tailwind and this talk, we're going to touch on the mirage of separation of concerns. This is a very bold claim, so hold on with adding me just yet. And then we're going to follow that up with utility first styling. So this is the alternative approach that libraries such as Tailwind take. And we'll talk about the benefits and the philosophy behind why you should use utility first styling. And then afterwards, we'll introduce Tailwind, exploring some of the pros, some of the places where it lags behind, so some of the cons to the approach, followed by a live demo, which will most definitely go wrong at some point, famous last words. And lastly, just some closing thoughts, and hopefully following that by a Q&A. But just before I jump into this talk, I was having a chat with a colleague about this talk a few days ago, and that night I took a long, hard stare at myself in the mirror and asked why. Now, mind you, this wasn't me having some sort of existential doubt or going through some sort of early onset midlife crisis. I was asking myself, why am I doing this talk? I personally think that the way that we approach styling over the years hasn't adopted at the same speed in line with the paradigm shifts that we've seen in most front-end development. And my hope is that this talk will spur some sort of conversation, some questions about the ways that we can improve styling and make it a bit more efficient in our day-to-day development. And I say this with the utmost sincerity. I am not trying to start a holy war in the community about which styling library works best. I don't want to say that you should strip out, if you have a React project, you should strip out style components and use Tailwind instead, or that you should fully adopt all of your projects to use Tailwind. But I want to explore what works well with Tailwind and what we can learn from it in our day-to-day styling. All right, let's jump right into it. So the mirage of separation of concerns, with the caveat that I will only be making this very, very bold claim when it comes to front-end development. So that asterisk is there to hopefully save me some slack. So take a few seconds to think about the concept of separation of concerns and try to come up for a definition that makes sense to you. When I was working on this presentation, I looked around a lot for various definitions, and you get them in many forms, but the simplest, most generic one that I came across was this one. Don't write your program as one solid block. Instead, break up the code into chunks that are tiny pieces of the system, each able to complete a simple, distinct job. And this is seen all around in programming and development. The most common example that you'll get is the intranet protocol stack. So each layer within the intranet should, in theory, be separated from the other layers. It doesn't have any information about the other layers. And the idea and one of the benefits is that they all do small individual parts of connecting users to the internet. You can take away the network layer, and hopefully the rest of the system can function if you were to insert a different implementation of that layer. So you see this in different places as well. So if you're working on backend architecture, a classic example is the CQRS architecture approach, where your mutations and your querying is completely separated out. They're abstracted away so that each single small component deals with certain concerns. And also, of course, in front-end development, the traditional model here is that each bit of the front end is independent from each other and that they're dealing with each of the concerns. So we've got the structure layer that's handled by HTML. We've got the styling layer that's handled by the CSS, and the functionality, of course, is handled by JavaScript. So let's jump in a little bit more into the front-end development side of things. How is this done on the web? So we have a little sort of example on the right. This is some very classic HTML. And this, what you're seeing here is the semantic approach, which handles separation of concerns, oftentimes referred to as the block element modifier approach. And the idea here is that you avoid any styles coming into your markup. So at the top, you can see that the class names here within the HTML are done in a manner where they're talking about the semantic value and what the information is within this web page or within this view that you're displaying. So things like author bio, another class is the author bio image, author bio content, author bio name. Again, very semantic, very informational about what data is going in, what is the content. And so your styles here are going to be based off of these class names. So you will separate these out completely. So none of your styles are actually leaking into your markup. This is the classic approach. And this doesn't violate separation of concerns. However, and there is a but here, your markup has actually come into your styles. So there is an illusion of separation of concerns, but in reality, that is the mirage. And if you look at how we develop these days, this mirage is actually is really highlighted to a larger degree. Separation of concerns is violated in various places when we're looking at front-end development. Specifically when it comes to React, the very foundations of React and a lot of other JavaScript frameworks is based on violating separation of concerns, making it simpler for you to put and combine your markup and your functionality together. So JSX, which is one of the biggest selling points of React, if not the biggest selling point of React, is markup within functionality. It's built on the premise of violating separation of concerns. And similarly, there's various other libraries that we use in day-to-day development. So if you're working on a React project, style components, which is one of the most widely used libraries for styling, is putting styling into your functional components. You're taking a component and you're styling it. So you're coupling together these different concerns, and it's already being violated. So very much this concept of separation of concerns, specifically when it comes to front-end development, when it comes to web dev, is not necessarily something that is strictly adhered to, and is already being sacrificed for certain benefits that we get by combining some of these components. And again, there's various other examples of how there are new frameworks and there's new technologies that are violating separation of concerns. Another framework that recently came out that got a lot of news was Svelte, and Svelte couples together your styling, your markup, and your functionality all within one file natively. So I think that's the general trend of where front end is going at. And so this mirage of separation of concerns is in fact not necessarily being applied to the full extent anymore. And that leads us forward to utility first styling. And so this is an alternative approach taken. So what does utility first styling mean? The idea is that you prioritize reusability above all else. And so you start asking yourself questions about what is the most common CSS that you find yourself writing. And I'm sure that there is these things that you find that you are consistently adding into your code. Things like adding a margin right of about 7 pixels. Other things like setting the font size to a specific value. So the font size of, let's say, 2 rem. Or adding a border radius of 100% to get that very nice, fully rounded profile picture that we have on probably most of our websites, on most of our personal portfolios. So these are the common bits and components that you put within your styling on a day-to-day basis. So what utility first styling suggests is just put them in a class. Make each one of these small individual components a single class. So the first one on the left is margin right small. So you add a small margin to the right of this component or this element. The next one is setting the text size to medium. You define these aliases and you say, I have a class now. For whenever I want to have a medium-sized text, I will just use this class. And the last one, of course, as it's self-explanatory, is full rounded. And so the goal, ultimately, is for you to be able to create new components without touching CSS. So you have a set of predefined, highly reusable classes. Whether or not you make them yourself or you use a library is a different story. But the idea is that you, in theory, would never need to go in and create additional classes, because you could always combine certain classes from these highly reusable classes that you've predefined to build completely new components and style it however you'd like. So these utility classes are usually setting things like the font color, maybe the font size, the weighting of the fonts. Things like flexbox and grid is a very common piece of functionality that you'll find plenty of within your CSS. And also things like setting the padding and the margin. So you might be thinking to yourself, what is the benefit to taking this approach as opposed to that separation of concerns approach? Well, I'm going to highlight two main ones, but there's a whole sort of literature on the internet if you want to go ahead and research some of the added benefits of taking this approach. But the main one that I want to focus on is consistency. And so we've got the Steve Ballmer developers GIF here. I really want to stress the consistency approach. By having and defining these smaller reusable classes, you have less choice in terms of having sort of blunders within the values that you set in your CSS. So if you're not constantly interacting with CSS, manually setting the text size to a certain number of rem, or manually setting the margin and the padding every single time you want to build a new component, then there's less grounds for you to fall into inconsistencies. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, this is the type of thing that code reviews are for. You'll get one of your peers to look at your code and maybe see, hey, this font size that you've used isn't actually standard in line with what we've been using. However, I want to point to the data here to show that this isn't always necessarily upheld in practice. So as an example, you might, somebody went through a list of some of the big sort of tech websites, things like GitHub, things like Stripe, and GitLab, and they looked at their style sheets and the number of text colors that they had, the number of background colors that they had, and all of their styling. And so they found that even across some of these websites where, I'm sure they have very, very talented developers, the number of inconsistencies is massive. You get on GitLab 402 different text colors, several hundred background colors, and 59 different font sizes. So that oftentimes will occur when you have something like the font size set to 1.3 rem instead of 1.25 rem. And so having your hands open isn't always the best thing in this case. Another benefit is the speed. So a lot of people have been about saying that by using utility-first styling, or Tailwind specifically, their speed of development has massively accelerated. And the idea is you're not constantly needing to jump between your CSS and your component. You can just stay within your component. And if you're familiar with the class names, which I'll touch on slightly later, if you're familiar with the class names, you can simply just use them repeatedly within your code, and it's less flicking between different parts of your code and looking and referencing different parts of your code. And in theory, that makes it a lot quicker to code and to just push out pieces of functionality and deliver value. So how does this end up looking in code? So these are a lot of abstract ideas. How does it end up actually manifesting within code? So what you get is something like this. Now, if you take a look at some of the class names here, these are somewhat descriptive of what the styling actually should look like. So you've got a div here called card, and then it's rounded. So you can see rounded corners around the card. It's got a little bit of a shadow. Again, you can see that here. It's got a padding Y, so PY of 3, and this is some 3 units, so to speak, and we'll touch more on that. PX4, so there's a padding on the X side for 4, so on and so forth. And some of these make sense. So you've got things like flex being dealt with in part of a utility class. You've got things like the text being set to large for this title. Again, padding here, borders, so on and so forth. This isn't Tailwind, but this is following the ideas of utility for styling. And when you show this to people for the first time, typically the reactions are not the most favorable. So you get the classic people just shrugging it off and saying that the whole idea is stupid and you might as well just be using inline styles for your entire project. You get somebody who's gone on a rant and is a little upset about Tailwind, and they give it a fair shot, but they don't really like it anymore. And then you just get the blatant rants completely trashing Tailwind and everything to do with utility for styling. So the initial approach, the initial response that people give is not very favorable, to say the least. And so at this point, you might be thinking to yourself in this presentation, is this guy that's sitting out here talking to you about utility for styling and Tailwind an absolute madman? And should we just ignore everything he's saying? And I want to loop back to the why of this talk. And I want to say that pragmatically, I don't believe that this approach should be applied to every single project that you're making. I think that it's good for certain projects. I think that there's a lot to learn from this, but I fundamentally don't think that you should strip out everything that you've been using for styling and replace it with Tailwind. So that's the idea of utility first styling. If you're interested in learning more about sort of the theoretical aspect of what goes behind Tailwind and some of the thinkings behind it, the creator, Adam Wenthon, he's written a great blog post, which if you just search up utility first styling and separation of concerns, he talks about this, the paradigms, what the thinking was behind it, and some of the examples that are used here are straight from that blog post. So I would highly recommend giving that a read. But as he mentions as well, this is the type of thing that you just need to try once until you just have to try it once, and then you'll hopefully understand how it works, and it'll kind of make more sense. So yeah, let's go ahead with that and introduce Tailwind now. So Tailwind capitalizes on this whole idea, this whole concept of utility first styling, and comes pre-built with these utility first styles, or these utility first classes essentially. And so it's been getting a lot of headway within the front-end development community because of the various reasons that I mentioned. So let's take a look at this to start with. So this is from the Tailwind website. If you go onto the main page, you'll see this example. And so you can see how quickly the code styles are changing for this card component just by adding a few class names to it. So the image gets rounded, the margins get set to auto, which makes it centered. The font gets set to semi-bold, medium for the caption. We set the color of the name to be cayenne, and we set the color of the other one to change. So very quickly, you can see that the styles are changing massively. And so you'll see right there, they added a media query, and automatically it's fully responsive. And so I'll touch on some of the pros and the cons of what Tailwind offers as a library. So to start off with, some of the pros of Tailwind. Massive manual styling time is saved, and I can't emphasize this enough. Most of the styles that you would ever need to do come pre-built as part of this library, so to speak. And if you want to set things like the width of a component, you can do that. If you want to set it to different shades of a color, and as I'll touch on afterwards, this is fully customizable as well. You can do that. You can set different states. So on hover, setting the background to a certain color, on focus, setting the background to another color. Again, this is for web specifically, but since these sort of hover and focus states don't work on React Native, but the functionality is there, and it tries to imitate almost everything that you would be able to do with CSS, but in a consistent, clean manner that will save you a lot of time. The next point is that it's highly portable. So by having your styles as part of your components, it means that if you're wanting to copy over a specific part of your component tree and move it to another project, or maybe another part of maybe another page, you can simply copy it over and it copies all of the styling with it. You don't need to be concerned with finding where the styles are. Maybe it's a few components up the tree and you need to copy the styles from there. There's none of that. It makes it highly portable, which I think is a very key and helpful pro of Tailwind. It makes developing and iterating a lot quicker again. Thirdly, it's entirely customizable. So there's a Tailwind's overrides file, and you can update all of the utility functions across the board by just updating that file. You can add new colors, you can modify the values that exist, maybe the units as well. So this makes it very customizable for projects. If you have specific needs that you want to style, or you have specific graphic designs that you want to stay on standard with, this will be highly customizable here. And lastly, responsiveness. So this is one of the things that one of my colleagues was telling me the other day. Tailwind comes out of the box with these great responsive media query classes. And if anyone's written CSS, you'll know that media queries can be sometimes a bit of a nightmare. So the responsiveness out of the box is one of the key selling factors here within Tailwind. Now let's touch on some of the places where it lags behind a little bit. This definitely takes an adjustment. So you've seen having your styles integrated within your markup. It's kind of a double-edged sword. And so what that means is oftentimes you'll have very, very verbose component and class names. And so that is definitely an adjustment. Some people really don't like it. Some people get used to it. So it's something to definitely consider. And I think that it's something that requires a bit of time, requires a bit of just experimenting with it. the syntax can become cluttered. Again, going back to this, I think this is it's a double-edged sword. It's great that it's highly portable, but it also means that in some cases, you're going to have a very cluttered syntax. And it's not a UI library. So it means that it doesn't come pre-built with these components that you can put into your project and just use them built out of the box. It's a very simple and quick way to make good components. So it's kind of synonymous with styled components rather than something like Material UI if you were using React. So those are some of the cons that I would mention. And of course, a bit of a learning curve. So you need to pick up the class names, which takes a little bit of time, a little bit of getting used to. Personally, it took me about an hour and a bit to fully get on board and really pick it up. I still refer to the documentation here and there, but there's some great ecosystem being built around it where you have IntelliJ where you have VS Code plugins and whatnot that allow you to fill in and autocomplete some of these class names. So it's becoming much simpler to pick it up, and I think the learning curve is quite minimal compared to a lot of other technologies. Cool. So without further ado, let's jump into the demo. And I'm going to shift over to my handy VS Code and emulator that I've got open. As John mentioned, go and use Expo. It's great. It makes the process of spawning something up like this massively simple. And honestly, I would highly recommend it, especially if you're starting out with React Native. So let's jump into our app components. I've got something sort of set up here. It comes with this little badge here in a view that says Hello Tailwind, and another view here that's kind of styled like a button with the text here, big red button. It's obviously not styled, but we're going to do that together, and hopefully we'll learn a thing or two about it while we go ahead with that. Awesome. So let's begin by changing the color of this text. So this isn't very viewable. We've got a gray background. It's not very user friendly. So let's go ahead and just change that to white. So as you might expect, it might be something like text white. And as you put that in, we'll save it. And there, your text is changed to white. So that's good first step. Let's keep going with it and see what else we can get. Let's remove this margin. So this is a MT12, which means a margin top of 12 units. And you can refer back to the Tailwind documentation about these units. So let's get rid of MT12. And so what that'll do, hopefully, is shrink this margin in between the red button and this Hello Tailwind badge. And so we've got that. Great. So we already have a padding here for our button. So we have a padding X of 4 and a padding Y of 2 units. We have a border. We've set that border to transparent so that we don't have any default borders. And we've set the text size to be small with a font weight of medium. So it's slightly emboldened. Now let's add a background because this isn't very viewable right now. Let's add a background of, and at this point I get a little stuck and I'm thinking to myself, what were the colors that Tailwind has? So if you have the Tailwind documentation open, and this is their really nice website, you can quickly go ahead and search the docs and find the name of the classes or what you're looking for. So let's say I'm looking for indigo. You can see the different colors that exist here. So let's say I want to look at the backgrounds. Let's click on this indigo here, and it'll show us the range of different colors that they have within this documentation. I must say this is probably one of the best documentations that I've personally seen with any library. So it's really, truly fascinating to me. So I've taken a look at the colors. I think the background indigo of 600 looks good to me. So let's go ahead and add that. And so we now have an indigo button. Great. Now let's make this a rounded, let's add a bit of rounding to this, but let's see what the different classes are that we can add to this. So there's a rounded small, there's a rounded, and there's a rounded medium. I like the rounded medium, so we're going to go ahead and add that. Cool. So we now have a slightly rounded button. Great. Now this Hello Tailwind tag was good, but let's switch it up a little bit because I don't think it's particularly very useful right now. Let's see if we can try to shape this as a notification counter type of looking view. So let's add the number 1 here to give it text. Cool. That was good. So now let's change the text to actually be red. I'll put it to red to 900, and let's keep the font as semi-bold, so it's slightly emboldened. So that color is red, although it's not really showing. And let's go ahead and start changing some of the positioning. So let's firstly change this background yellow to also be red before that. So we've gone ahead and done that, and we'll just get rid of the padding altogether. So we'll say it should be a width of 6 and a height of 6 as well. And so we've done that, but that's messed up our text. That's all right. We're going to go ahead and copy some of the classes here that I have from before. So we're going to set it to flex on the column direction, and we'll center the items and set a justify center as well. And then by doing that, hopefully we should get a fully centered text. Great. So that's worked out there. Let's go ahead and now see if we can position this button, this notification counter right on the corner of there. So let's go ahead and start. I don't remember the inset value, so I'm just going to quickly flip back to the Tailwind docs. So there's a left 2. Let's look at that. Awesome. So we have something like that. There's the left 1, left -1. And so you get all these different rem values here that are, again, fully customizable. If you don't like the values here, or if they don't work within your styling standards, you can go ahead and change them in the Tailwind config overrides. So let's go back. So they've got things like left, and it's a dash. So it's things like a top dash 3.5. So let's try to do that and see where we can get. So let's start with left 2 and see how that works. Okay, just moved it a little bit. Still not the best thing. Let's move it to 2.5. But before we do that, let's actually move this alignment to the right. So what this means is we'll set the text align to be the end. So now our view has both the button and the notification counter pushed to the end, so it's right aligned, so to speak. So now we've set this to left 0.2, still not fully to where I would like to get it at. So let's give it a shot for 2.5 maybe. Great, I think that looks good to me. Let's add a top as well. So let's try a top of 1. Still not as far down as I would like that to be. So let's do top of 3 there. Okay, that's good. The Z index isn't looking too good though, so let's just add a Z index. So I happen to know off the top of my head that the Z index is just simply Z10. And if we do that, we've just given it a Z index of 10. And so just through that, without defining any styles whatsoever, we've gone ahead and we've created some wonderful styling out of the box with all of the Tailwind utility first classes. So that's kind of a demo of how it works with React Native. You need to include these Tailwind, the Tailwind function, so to speak, at the beginning to use the styles here. But other than that, it's very much similar to how you would use Tailwind on the web, and it's very simple to install. It's the Tailwind RN library. So there's currently 2 main libraries that are being developed. This is the more popularly adopted one. So you can just have a look in GitHub. It's very straightforward to install. And I think it's an added benefit that you can have very similar styling on your web and what you have on your React Native platform. And I think that's a massive win as opposed to having to adjust and adapt the styling specifically for mobile. So yeah, that's that with the demo. Let's quickly go back. So just finishing up on some final thoughts. I think that Tailwind has really spurred up this question about not repeating yourself within styles. And I think that's a very valid point that you don't see in a lot of styling. A lot of the styles that we write in our day-to-day happens to be very repetitive. It's not very in line with the functional paradigms that the web is now built on with React and other frameworks. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned from Tailwind, and hopefully as it becomes more widely adopted, some of the criticism that people have about it, whether it being too cluttered or various other criticisms that might arise from it, I think a lot of those hopefully gets addressed by the creators of Tailwind. Ultimately, I think it's a great way to quickly get things up and running, and it's a different approach, which I personally quite like. Yeah, with that, I think let's conclude. And if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to open the floor.